Okay. We're going to complete this today, and I hope by the time that we're done today, you gain, even if you don't understand every single issue, you at least gain an appreciation for what was happening 300 years prior to the Council of Nicaea, which led to that council, and how that council ultimately winds up becoming, for better and worse in many instances, the model that the church adopts when dealing with major issues right up to 20th century. It became a little fractured in the from the Reformation on, well actually even before that, from the 1400s on. But the point is, councils became an integral part of how the church deals with challenging questions. As we can see, the Synod of Antioch, in 325, was the overture for Nicaea. And the themes, if you'll notice the number of times Antioch is mentioned, the themes that occur in Antioch make their appearance in Nicaea, and we will see that as we move forward. Now, at the outbreak of the discussion of the issue of the Trinity, it might not seem that that became the primary focus, because the theological issue at stake prior to all of these, prior to Nicaea, basically was much narrower, and it was the status of, and here's where it's helpful to just glance down at your Gnostic chart, because that becomes the backdrop for these terms and why these terms become challenging. The issue that really arose was the status of the Word and his relationship to the Godhead. Was he fully divine in the same precise sense of divinity when speaking of the Father? Was he really akin to the Father? Or was he, after all, a creature? No doubt superior to the rest of creation, even given the courtesy designation of divine, but all the same separated by an unbridgeable chasm from the Godhead. Once these questions had been raised, as a course of the controversy was to reveal, the further question of what Christians meant by the divine triad, by the Trinity, could not be evaded. This is the problem. Let's not say problem. This is the challenge that always arises when people raise questions about theological terms. Because eventually what has to happen is there must be a definition. And once you start defining terms, then you start unpacking people's ideology. And that's what happens here. There's an interesting historical side note to all of this leading up to Nicaea, and that is we have very, very, very little information as to what the Western Church thought. And if you look at your map, you'll see why I say the Western Church. If you look all the way at the top, where it says Bithynia and Pontus, look right above the I and the T in Bithynia, and you see Nicaea. All right? Nicaea is in what we consider today modern Turkey. So, when we start to unpack all of this, we see that we're looking primarily at an Eastern emphasis on this discussion. And with the exception of maybe Pope Dionysius, a few generations earlier, there really is very little information as to what the Western Church thought about this. Because the Western Church was more interested in the unity of divinity. And you will see that when we start talking about some of these challenging issues. But the Western Church was looking for divine unity and found distinctions that we're going to be discussing in the Godhead very mysterious. It's like, this is kind of material, and we don't want to get into it. They do get into it, but anyway.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Which Antioch? I see there's two on the map. One
Yes.
in the middle and one way over on the right.
Mm-hmm.
Which was or both?
I don't know the question you're asking.
Which one are you talking about up there with Antioch?
I'm talking about the one to your left.
Okay.
I mean,
In the middle.
To the right.
To the right.
I'm not looking at the map.
I see, okay.
Are you talking about the kingdom of Antiochus?
No, Antioch is right above Galatian Phrygia. There's an Antioch.
Phrygia.
Right in the middle. And then, of course, there's the one on the right.
By Syria.
Yeah,
The one in Syria is
the main one.
yeah, that's the one.
To the left of Lyconia.
Away.
A in Galatia, in the big letter, is an Antioch.
Okay, Antioch right there. Okay.
Yeah,
And
That's mine.
Lyconia. No, the one all the way to the right.
is the big one.
That's the most important one.
Okay.
All right, and we'll get to that in just a second. But the information that we have about the Council of Nicaea specifically is primarily comes from the East, where the dominant influence remained Origen. Origen held sway. Okay. Since you mentioned Antioch, why does that stand out? There's a very interesting biblical and historical connection with the city of Antioch, especially when we start getting into these difficulties.
It's where they were first called Christians.
Okay, that's one. Something happened in Antioch that wound up affecting the early church, and still to this day is one of the most important elements of early Christianity. The church at Antioch was the church that commissioned Paul and Barnabas for their first missionary journey. Now, keep that in mind when we get to this and we start talking about Antioch and what transpired in the 200 years from the time that they commissioned Paul and we arrive at the first council. See what happened in that 200 years. So, let's begin and let's start talking about these theological precursors, which set the stage. It provides the backdrop for what will lead us to Nicaea. And as we saw last week, Gnosticism was prevalent during this time period. It really had a significant presence in the church at this time. And it manifested itself prior to Nicaea in modal monarchianism and dynamic monarchianism, in these two forms, primarily between the 2nd and the 3rd centuries. So we're looking at the late 100s and the middle 200s, as you can see, right here. The Antiochian school tended to stress, and these are three of the key elements. The Antiochian school stressed the uniqueness of the Father, the humanity of Christ, and practical Christian living, ethics and morality. And we'll see that in just a moment. Their hermeneutic was wooden literalism. Jesus is the door. You had hinges and a doorknob. We're talking, they were really literal. I'm not saying they believed that. I'm just using that as a hyperbole. Monarchianism, as we talked about in the definition of the term, comes from two words, mono, only, alone, and arche. Remember your chart. Arche. One being, one beginning, one ruler, one God. And monarchianism saw as its primary foil, if you will, the exaltation of Christ. How are we going to look at this person and determine our interaction with him? The idea was to preserve the place of God the Father in theology as the one arche, the one being in the universe. Okay? Now I hope, as I'm starting to explain this, you're starting to see why Nicaea becomes so critical, because these are the very issues that get addressed when Nicaea handles the question of the relationship of Christ to the Father. Now notice, it's Christ and the Father. Now I'm going to say something, and I'm going to say it very cavalierly. It's not exactly the proper way of saying it, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Holy Spirit's an afterthought in Nicaea. The Holy Spirit was an honorable mention. He really is not the focus. He becomes the focus in the next council, Constantinople, and subsequent to that. So we're looking now at this challenging question, who is Christ in relationship to the Father? Now both of these monarchian representations attempted to preserve the distinction of the Father, but wanted in some way to give Christ an exalted, elevated status in their theology. So, as in any challenge to Christianity, we have to be honest when we critique them. It's very easy for us, and we often do it very flippantly, when we say, yeah, he's a heretic. But we're looking at Christianity 2,000 years later, standing on the shoulder of all of the great thinkers of the church. Put yourself in their place at the very beginning. You want to believe in monotheism, right? That's Judaism is a monotheistic religion. Yet we have this outlier, this unique person. How does he relate to the monotheism that we believe? Very, very challenging at the outset. And this is why terms, definitions, and precision become so critical within Christianity. So, first, and I have briefly talked about these in the past, so I'll just kind of highlight the main elements. Modal monarchianism is, well, both of the forms of monarchianism come out of Gnosticism. All right. For the modal for the modal monarchist, this is their roadmap. Okay, and we've talked about it. The higher you go, the closer you are to the arche, to the one true being. All right, and the closer you get to God. Right. Christ is the highest form, mode, or emanation, and I want you to write that word down because that comes into play significantly when we get to Origen, or aeon. Christ is the highest aeon. Now, what we encounter with modal monarchianism is this gentleman called Sabellius. Sabellius is the father, the originator of the system that followed him, Sabellianism. And Sabellius taught, this is why this becomes critical, Sabellius taught that Jesus was of the Homoousios. Homo meaning same, ousios being substance, essence. In some cases it can mean being, but we want to stick with substance or essence. That Jesus was of the same, notice, Homoousios. He was of the same essence of the Father, but was not God in the sense that he was of the arche. Now, we've talked about this and you've heard me say this in the past. If you encounter a heresy today, I can guarantee you, you will find it in the first 4 centuries of the church. And this Sabellianism, modal monarchianism, exists today. How many people here have encountered a United Pentecostal individual or are familiar with United Pentecostalism? Do you know the other title of United Pentecostalism? Oneness Pentecostalism. They are Sabellian. They reject the status of Christ as being of the same essence as God. Okay. Sabellius would describe the relationship between Christ and the Father, and note this, because this is one of those ironies of history. He would describe that relationship in the analogy of the sun and the rays. The sun is the Father. The rays are Jesus. Jesus is the most dominant, the most prominent, the most spectacular of all the rays. But they are not the sun. And he is not the sun. His ray is not the sun. Jesus is not of the same essence of the Father. He is not the same. They are of the same Homoousios. So Sabellius and his followers could say that Jesus was light of light. Interesting that we say light of light every Sunday when we recite the Nicene Creed. Some have even said you can say God of God, but not in the same way. So,
Can I go
Wha-
back to the term arche?
Yep.
Okay, up here at the top I thought was the big arche, the main thing. And I thought that when we were talking about Gnosticism, Yahweh was down here.
All the way
under-
down there, uh-huh.
Under wisdom,
Was a, yes, it was a creation of wisdom.
wisdom. So, but I thought I heard you say that Christ was the highest emanation, the highest arche. So was Christ back up here, or was this not, how did those two fit together?
How does,
If you say
Right.
Christ is the highest arche, does that mean he
he's
was?
the, he's,
up
no,
here?
he's the, okay, highest may not have been the right. He's the, if you look at the chart, what you see is that, and you'll understand it when we start explaining how this transpires. Remember, this is not physical. So you're not talking about a physical being, all right? So whatever we talk about here is not physical. The physical doesn't arrive until Sophia. And that will come into play when we start talking about adoptionism. But when you look at this, you'll see that there's, at the top, there are those three. There's nous, truth, logos, and life, right? Those are the three. And if you look at the way it manifests itself, arche and enoia give birth or create, or from them emanate mind and truth, and from them emanate logos and life. Okay? So, when we talk about that which makes up Jesus, in their mind, not in our mind, you have to think in their mind, that's why they see it, the spiritual, they see as close to the arche as possible without actually being the arche. All right? It really is, it's muddy, but this is how they look at it. And when we get to adoptionism, you'll see how it then converts into this world. So when Sibelius starts talking about these things, what you're talking about are relationships, but there's no real distinction between Father, Son, and Spirit. And one of the ways that he described it was God appeared as the Father during creation, he appeared as the Son in redemption, and he appears as the Spirit in sanctification. And we spoke briefly about the problem that this creates when it involves theology, because we get into patripassianism, that the Father, being the Son, died on the cross. Real mess. Real mess. Adoptionism tries to do a nice little Fred Astaire two-step and sidestep that problem, and we'll get to that in a minute. So, Sabellianism was actually very popular in this region. However, in 268, now mind you, you see all of these? 264, 65, 66, 67, up to 268. There were 3 or 4 different councils in Antioch, all dealing with the same question. Just kept going on and on and on and on and on. Eventually, Sibelius was determined to be a heretic in 268. He was excommunicated, and Homoousios was deemed a heretical term. And the church opted for Homoiousis. One theologian basically said, which I kind of clever. One theologian basically said that the church was divided over a diphthong. O-I. Okay? Some of the biggest names in the early church: Hippolytus, Tertullian, Dionysius of Alexandria, Basil the Great, all opposed this particular expression of the relationship between Christ and the Son. They all opposed Sabellianism. Now, not only is it found today in United Pentecostalism, it also made its appearance during the Reformation. Anybody know who was the Arch-Sabellian during the Reformation. He's a big name. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. He's a well-known name. Creates a lot of controversy and misunderstanding. His name is Miguel Servetus. Miguel Servetus was a physician, and he wrote all sorts of theological treatises on why the Trinity wasn't real. He was a Sabellian. He eventually winds up writing to Calvin in Geneva, and Calvin and Sabellius have this exchange. At the same time, Servetus is under interdict by the Roman Empire to be executed on sight. That's what Rome said. Rome said he is to be executed on sight. No trial, he's a heretic, he dies. Servetus writes Calvin, and writes Calvin, and writes Calvin, and he keeps criticizing Calvin, and he keeps saying your view of the Trinity is incorrect, and I'm going to come to Geneva and I'm going to challenge you, and Calvin begged him not to come. Begged him. Do not come. You will be arrested and tried. Do not come. Servetus ignored Calvin's plea, shows up on a Sunday while Calvin is preaching, stands up in the middle of Calvin's sermon, and accuses Calvin of being a heretic. He was immediately arrested, and he was tried, and he was convicted. Now everybody at this point accuses Calvin of killing Servetus. Calvin had nothing to do with the death of Servetus. Calvin wasn't even a citizen of Geneva. He had no rights. He was, however, subpoenaed by the prosecution as an expert witness in theology. And he provided the theological testimony that put the so-called nail in Servetus' coffin. Servetus was then condemned to be burned at the stake, and Calvin pled for mercy. He said, if you're going to kill him, at least do it quickly. Behead him, don't burn him. And they basically told Calvin to go pound sand because they wanted to set an example. And they burned Servetus at the stake. So when you hear the name Miguel or Michael Servetus, understand the proper context. He would have been killed by anybody that found him. And Calvin had nothing to do with it. He was simply a witness. That's all he was.
Spell his last name, please.
Severtus.
Thank you.
No, that's wrong. I'm sorry. I spelled it. It's Servetus. I always do that. I always include the extra E in there. Servetus. Servetus. I don't know why I pronounce it to spell it incorrectly. So anyway. Now here's the problem. Sabellianism was really popular because Sabellianism makes the Trinity understandable. It's very simple. You got three people and they just happen to go into the phone booth and change clothes and come out and somebody else. So it's a much simpler explanation, and simplicity always gains followers. Unfortunately, it is not biblically accurate. So there arises then a middle position, and here's the middle position. The middle position is referred to as Homoiousis. Homo is same, homoi is like or similar. This Homoiousis became the primary understanding of the relationship between Christ and the Father for the next 60 years. That became the view. Until a gentleman by the name of Athanasius throws his hat into the discussion. And we will get to Athanasius the next time when we actually get to the council. But Athanasius resurrects the term homoousios. But it is not readily and immediately accepted. So what they choose is homoiousios because it is a middle term between this, homoousios, between same substance, and the Arian position, which ultimately was, I'll spell it so that you'll know what it looks like, A-N-O-M-O-I, there's that diphthong, O-I-O-S. Anamoios, which basically means dissimilar completely. Is the alpha privative, it's the negation of the term that follows. Okay? So an is the form, n is the consonant that appears before a vowel. So anyway, just basic grammar. But anyway, if you look at O-M-O-I-O-S, that's the primary term. Okay? So the Arians are denying that. However, ultimately, these two camps were reconciled. And they merge, grudgingly, mind you. They merge grudgingly because of the work of the Cappadocian Fathers. And if you look at your map and you look to the right in the center of the page, you look to the right, you'll see Cappadocia. And there are the various cities in Cappadocia from which these gentlemen derive. Basil the Great, and he's not Basil, he's not a condiment, he's a church father. Gregory of Nazianzus, which is a pain to say, but Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa, who is Basil the Great's brother. All three are bishops. And all three are brilliant theologians, and most critically, you're not going to like this, they are philosophers. And it is their philosophic input dealing with these terms that form the concrete expression of the Council of Nicaea. They stand at the pinnacle of rectifying the issue, because what nobody today remembers is that after 325, when Arius was declared a heretic, it lasted for about 5 minutes. And from 325 to 381, Athanasius was repeatedly exiled and threatened with death. And the Arian party ruled for almost 60 years. Heresy ruled the church until the Council of Constantinople in 381. So we have Nicaea in 325, and then we have Constantinople, and I think I gave you a brief little chart. And I'm hoping that when we get to each of these councils, you can fill in your own notes and make your own notes in that blank section that I left you. Because this is how all of this played out. So when we look at Nicaea in 325, we really don't have a resolution until the Cappadocians step in, and we have 381, where this finally gets put to rest once and for all. Okay? There was also a significant negative backlash to the Arians' Homoiousis understanding, but the real meat was provided by the Cappadocian Fathers, because, and we will get to that when we get to Constantinople, basically because I just love talking about philosophy, but their input is brilliant, the way they dissect the language. Anyway, so that leaves modal monarchianism. Now we move into the next one, dynamic monarchianism or adoptionism. Now adoptionism, if you'll notice, was formulated by a gentleman by the name of Paul of Samosata.
Could you lift that up a little bit? There you go.
Okay? Paul of Samosata. Now, Paul stated that the Logos, okay, the Logos, and I want you to think about the word when you think about John chapter 1. Because Paul of Samosata said the Logos was an impersonal attribute of God, which descended upon Jesus at his baptism. And the Holy Spirit descended like a dove. Okay? So this impersonal attribute receives this emanation, this elevation at his baptism. And I think I've told you the story more than one time, but I was watching, me and a buddy of mine were watching the televangelists. We took that bet, we bet each other how long it would take for a heresy to pop up. This was the heresy that popped up, adoptionism. 15 seconds since turning the program on. 15 seconds. And they stated outright, now Jesus became the Son of God at his baptism. I was like, okay, if you say so. Up until his baptism, Jesus was just a guy. He was just a man, no different than you or I. But the descension of the Logos, now here's where your question comes in. The Spirit now skips over all of this, finds Sophia's creation, and boom, now we have Christ. And when we get into what Origen was experiencing, we'll get into the traversing back. That's why it's so laborious, because the Logos kind of just cut to the head of the line. But now we have to go all the way back through each of these elevations, according to.
How did they explain the birth of Jesus with Mary in the Gospels if he wasn't God beforehand, before the baptism? That was just.
There's a couple of different explanations that arise about the birth. The most common one that was floating around at this time was that Mary had a liaison with a Roman soldier. Others said that it was Joseph, but they rejected the virgin birth.
So just,
Yeah, it was rejected outright. Okay, because that would have obviously been a problem for them to explain. So they reject the virgin birth, and then boop, the Logos makes its appearance. Now, I told you that there was this moral and ethical element that we talked about with Sabellius, excuse me. Well, here it really hits. The descension of the Logos on Jesus didn't affect initially any miraculous element. What it did was it affected a unique moral, ethical unity between Jesus and the Father, such that had never existed between a man and God before. So they view the relationship morally and ethically. So that's why it's called adoptionism, because at his baptism, the Father morally and ethically adopts Jesus as his Son. And this unity could be called uniquely, Jesus could be called in this unity the Son of God. He is not the eternal Son of God, however. He is the adopted Son of God. He begins as a mere man, but because of this unique moral unity achieved by the power of God at his baptism, remember, he was an impersonal attribute of God. Jesus becomes dynamic. He becomes the Son of God, and therefore worthy of our worship. So, in the life of Christ, in this scheme, there is change. There is a process for all of my Whiteheadian devotees. There's an ongoing dynamic progression of who this person Jesus is. Paul was the bishop of Antioch in the middle. The bishop of Antioch, middle of the 3rd century, in the 260s. He was rich, and he did not like to be called bishop. This gives you some insight into the man. He liked to be called, you don't have to write this down, he liked to be called the procurator Ducanarius. He wanted to be the Duke of Earl. He wanted to be called the head duke. That's what he wanted to be called. So you want to talk about an ego, that way he didn't like bishop. Overseer wasn't enough. Episcopoi wasn't enough. I'm the Duke, and every time I say that, I want to sing the Duke of Earl. I just want to do it. But that's what he wanted. His teaching on the person of Christ. Notice how many condemned through each of the iterations of the council at Antioch, the Synod of Antioch, and he was eventually condemned in 268 and was removed from his bishopric.
Was he still Duke?
Once a Duke.
Well, in his own mind, I'm sure he was. I'm sure he was. Right. But according to dynamic monarchianism, the Word was, as in Sabellianism, an attribute of the Father. But they see it as the Father's reason or power, his dunamis, his dynamite. And it is clear that in his Christology, Paul was an out-and-out adoptionist, holding that in the incarnation, the Word descended on and dwelt in the man Jesus, who thus becomes the Son of God. Not the incarnation at his birth, at his baptism. And his use of the term, Homoousios, was to deny that the Word was a hypostasis. And we'll get to this in just one second, so that I'll make this, I'll espouse my own heresy and run the risk of heresy just to make it simple for you. But it was distinct from the Father. He denied that. Later, you'll see how all of this comes around. Later, Paul of Samosata was regarded as the progenitor, the great-grandfather of Nestorianism, of Nestorius. And whether Nestorius actually was a Nestorian, that's a question that church historians have been battling for centuries. Now, if you're interested, I can mention it later. I don't think it's that important, but we have three main historical sources as to why all of this is the case. If you're interested, I will tell you, but otherwise we can just move on. What makes this very, very critical is that Paul of Samosata's disciple, Lucian of Antioch, from 240 to January 7th of 312, he developed Paul's theory even further. God is one. Everything else is created. And what's interesting, if you want to put a little asterisk, a little check mark, a little underline by your note, some of the language you're going to hear in some of these heresies is the same language used by Islam when we get to the study in Islam. Makes you wonder where they got their ideas from. Okay? So, for Paul of Samosata, God is one, everything else is created, and the Logos is neither an eternal pre-existent person of the Godhead, nor is the Logos an eternal attribute of God. So he differs a little bit from his mentor. According to Lucian, the Logos is created. So, for Lucian, God sends the Logos into the world and takes it upon a human body, and in its creation and union with the human body, it is a mutable thing. It progresses. It changes. There is a process.
Isn't that just Arianism? Isn't that just basically?
Well, if you let me finish my sentence. But the Logos in man achieves immutability, which is an attribute of God. And so, in this sense, the Logos, or Jesus, becomes God. What does that sound like today, besides Jehovah's Witnesses? Who else? What other representation of a religion says that you can become a God? Mormonism. And this was the line of reasoning that Lucian used and influenced his most famous student, Arius. Okay? Now, finally, the last element, the Alexandrian school, or Origen. There is virtually no argument. It is inarguable that there is no greater thinker within the Alexandrian school than Origen. The school itself, the Alexandrian school, was highly Platonic. And now I'm not going to sit here and go into it today. I will talk about it when we get to the Cappadocians, because that's where it really makes its appearance. But it was, we would actually call it more Neoplatonic, but we'll just call it Platonic for now. And Origen taught and lived in the milieu that believed in the mind-body antithesis. Mind good, body evil. Ideas good, body physical bad. It's the form-substance dichotomy. Now, remember I said write, underline the word emanate? The intelligible world emanated. Now this is the setting in which Origen worked. the intelligible world, what we see, the physical world, emanated from God in eternal process. And the first stage was, what's the first stage under arche? Nous. The fall took place in the spiritual world, detaching the human soul and uniting it to the material world. And that's our sweetheart Sophia. The material world, being evil, shackled the soul. But through training and cleansing, it could arise into the presence of the arche. Now, this essentially is the core of Gnosticism. So the goal for the Gnostic was to bring about an ecstatic reunion with God via this process. And this is why many today have a problem with the perpetuation of sign gifts, because it seems to parallel the ecstatic experience of the Gnostics. Now, I'm not saying that that is what they believe. I'm simply saying this is why some, who are cessationists, find and take issue. I'll leave that up to you whether you think that there's any substantive connection. This is what Origen was dealing with. So this is where Origen developed his Trinitarianism. Origen is one of the most pathetic, and I don't mean it in the negative sense, I mean it in pathos, figures within the church, because of his brilliance and his ability and attempts to resolve problems. One of the first questions we were asked when we got to the Alexandria school when we got to the Alexandria school, when I was in seminary, our professor turned around and asked, "Is Origen a Christian?" And if you want to see a bunch of seminarians get into a fight in the middle of the classroom, ask that question. Because he believed some things that defined orthodoxy. And then he believed some things that were really problematic. Now, fortunately, I had a great church history professor, and he said, as I said, you have to understand the men at the time in history when they were dealing with these questions. Okay? But Origen taught, pay close attention, because this is what now sets the stage for Nicaea. Origen taught that the Logos was not created in time, but was begotten of God in eternity. And this birth in eternity is now, today, still debated amongst theologians. A very popular evangelical scholar recently repudiated what I'm about to tell you. Origen believed that this begottenness is referred to as the eternal generation of the Son, and was, and here's that word again, an emanation analogous to the emergence of the spirit world from divinity. Now, do you see how that sounds very close to Gnosticism? This is what happens when scholars, when brilliant men try to resolve issues in a time when they don't have the words at their disposal to distinguish what they're presenting from somebody else. So they have to accommodate and then redefine. And that's what Origen did. He accommodated by taking the term emanation, but he did not mean the same thing that the Gnostics meant.
You said eternal generation of Son's emanation analogous to something with the spirit world.
The emanation analogous to the emergence of the spirit world from divinity. So this sounds very similar. It sounds as if it's paralleling the Logos uniting with Sophia's offspring. That's what it sounds like, but that's not what he's saying, not at all. So for Origen, this emanating from the Father, this eternal generation, this eternal begottenness, this eternal relationship of the Father to the Son, where there is never, ever, ever a separation between who the Father is and who the Son is. He will always and forever be one from the Father, the unique one from the Father. And that's what creates this relationship. Now, according to Origen, the Logos is of the same essence. He is of the Homoousios. There it is. And Athanasius will pick up on this. He is from the Homoousios of the Father, contra, or in opposition to, our friend Paul of Samosata. Contrary to adoptionism. But is nevertheless different from the Father. Hypostasis, and in his human nature, he is subordinate to the Father. The Son is subordinate to the Father. Now, Origen was very conscious of monarchianism of both forms, and he tried to steer a middle road between the two, as you just heard. And that's what causes people to get upset. Because when you try to broach a middle way, what happens?
Nobody's happy.
You get assaulted from everybody.
Please, everybody.
You get attacked from everywhere. And that's what happened with Origen. The very philosophy which Origen regarded as an ally in his quest for the knowledge of God was the issue that caused the division, the split, the fissure, F-I-S-S-U-R, as in nuclear fissure. He caused the split that produced, guess who? Arius jumped all over this eternal begottenness. Origen never, ever, ever would have conceded to understanding the manner in what he was teaching in his theology that would have denigrated Jesus in any sense whatsoever. Unfortunately, that is precisely what happened, which leads to Nicaea. Now, I want to try and explain this to you so that you don't have to understand the minutiae, you don't have to sit there and try and be experts in Greek philosophy and theology. We've talked about homoousios, homo same, ousios being. This is what you need to understand. Ousios or substantia, the Latin, same thing. What we are talking about is essence. Now, I'm going to use a really, really, really bad analogy. But I'm hoping that when you strip away how bad it sounds, you'll get a sense as to what we're talking about. All right. I come from an Italian background. I have a father and a brother, right? Okay. As an Italian, I am of the same ousia or substantia as my father and my brother, right? But he's a father, I have a brother, I'm a son, so I am a different hypostasis. I am a different expression of that being, of that substance. So philosophically, not that you care, but philosophically, we argue this. Let's say, one essence or substance, three hypostasis, okay? Or, more simply, one G, three P. One God, three persons. Notice something very critical about that syllogism. That is not a contradiction. I am not saying one God and three gods or one person and three persons. I'm making a distinction. I'm saying there's one of these, but three of these. Okay? If you can hang on to that, you'll be fine. That's all you have to think about. Homoousios. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit are of the same of that. But because they are Father, Son, and the Spirit, they are of that. Okay? So far, so good? Okay. Any questions? We're done.